Hello, and for this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Francis Bacon in a standalone video and put him into a sort of a context, at least for my own channel's sake, I suppose, since I've been doing that for other thinkers, and give some ideas of myself of what I think of Francis Bacon, because I think he's a really interesting historical figure that is loaded with implications, especially in our sort of kind of dissident worldview. And one of the first things that, if we were going to go down that path, I suppose we would talk about him being the kind of natural philosopher. One of the last times we'll ever see that as really a kind of concept in the disciplines, because as a consequence of this, of course, you have the discipline of the sciences themselves as kind of a standalone, and then the subsequent categories that come about that. But he's doing this in this sort of context, though, of his historical time period, with a very sweeping change of religious persecution and really just authority as a whole of different Catholic and Protestant monarchs, and he wanted to kind of go off and do his own sort of thing. He wanted to have science be this own process that's examined without the worry of having any of the religious baggage with it. So he wants to get towards the actual efficient causes of what objects are or particular things, as opposed to worrying about the metaphysics of like the first principles, for example. That's like one of his main critiques with Aristotle, is how can we actually deduce what first principles are. Of course, Aristotle, he had his own answer for that, but that's not satisfying for Francis Bacon. And this is how we ultimately would push towards his kind of appropriation, really, of Aristotelian and Platonic language. The Neoplatonists were having a resurgence, of course, during this time period. And so he talks about forms and inductive reasoning. These are terms from people prior to him, and yet he wants to have his own sort of method. He wants to do things in his own sort of way. This is kind of, actually, funny enough, we'll get to later in the video, kind of critique of a particular tribe, where we could say that the Anglo is very historically well known for being able to appropriate and create anew concepts and ideas. Think of all the social justice articles from maybe 5 years ago, when they were even more relevant then, of constantly harping about cultural appropriation. This is because the Anglo and the British empiricist is rather good at doing these kind of things. And Francis Bacon is a Renaissance literary man, or at least he's seen in that sort of context. So there's something interesting about that as well. And I guess this could kind of lead into his idea of the cultural mandate of. But if we were going to move on and talk about the mandate, he is ultimately still from a theological school of thought. He wants to use these sciences for heavenly purposes. He wants to use the mandate through Adam and Eve as a sort of cultural mandate for ruling over and returning back through the processes of understanding nature itself. And that's how we can use this to overcome sin through societies and their well-being. He's very conscious of the sort of, I think, due diligence and kind of British duty that we hear talked about and romanticized to some degree, and the kind of due diligence of a public servant. I think he actually does refer to, being a sort of public servant in this kind of sort of right reason of ethics. But yeah, the mandate's important to contend with because he's ultimately taking, as a theologian, how can we use modern science almost as the instrumentation of sciences itself towards theological purposes of creating a right kingdom is what he is getting at. Of course, he doesn't necessarily, see that all knowledge to be gained is good and there can't be perversions. Of course not. He understands, just like the medievals, about you have the creation, and then you have sin that deviates away from us, and then we have the redemption. He's no different in that kind of aspect to it, but he does ultimately reject everyone else prior to him. And I think that is a distinct attribute that we could say about the kind of Anglo thought. And I guess that kind of leads into what I wanted to talk about, his kind of idols. And his idols are kind of interesting because he's, setting out things that could kind of get in the way of empirical reasoning and his kind of understanding of sophistry. And, one of the first ones is one I've used already several times in this video, and that's kind of, thoughts of the tribe. Now, of course, this I think actually is somewhat interesting because, as we go on towards the 1900s and genetics and its kind of discovery and Nietzsche taking a kind of philosophy of the races with the German and the French and the Anglo. And so it's kind of interesting to see Francis Bacon say, get away from tribal thought. And perhaps paradoxically, you could argue that that's actually, this sort of Anglo thought, being brought about the kind of questioning of authority, right? Because as I've already asserted earlier, you have a lot of different sort of theological implications of in a vacuum where you have, the Protestant Reformation and these kind of changing authorities over time. It kind of makes sense, why how an Anglo empire might function in a kind of foreshadowing sort of way. I think it's kind of interesting. The other one is he kind of appropriates, Plato's cave of, just being out in your own vices and your own sort of isolation from everything else and that way of thinking that comes with it. But I think, interesting enough, that kind of goes in tandem to what I just said with the tribe. I think that's actually another distinct idea in and of itself. And I think to some degree through that, you could argue that by being conscious of this cave, of never really being able to encapsulate these sort of universals and its own breaking down is actually a characteristic of this sort of temperament and this sort of characteristics within the civilization itself. Now, for the third one, I thought was really interesting because he actually talks about the market, and even in the Renaissance era, the market has this sort of almost mythical attribute to it because, well, I mean, the idea that the market would be worth mentioning as a kind of false idol to Bacon is telling in and of itself. But I think there's actually another point to be made as well, as it refers to, the language of the marketplace, the gossip of it, and the sort of language of the barter of transaction. And this, I think, is actually a pretty important point to make towards our contemporary time. The market, whether you want to have this sort of mythological idea, or even the kind of disciplinary spaces that would use the kind of market capitalism as explanations for the world at large, and the kind of economic incentives, and the kind of instrumentation of that kind of school of thought in economics. And nonetheless, I think he somewhat is kind of conveying a bigger point that language can be, in a way, a sort of framing all of its all onto itself. And I've already had my contention in past videos with the kind of critical race theorist and ideas towards ultimately kind of taking concepts of justice of the Western civilization and ultimately applying it to yourself while living in Western civilization is kind of unsatisfactory to me, not just on an intellectual basis, but on a moral basis as well. But I'm getting off beat here. But the fourth is, of course, theater, and kind of deviating away from what the empirical ideas could be, the kind of sophist rhetoric sort of thinking that he has lack of respect for. And of course, a lot of people would be accusing Bacon of setting the stage of the instrumental aspects of nature's revealing, and ultimately leading to its kind of plundering and undermining within the environment, environmental ideas and whatnot. But I think that is kind of broad stroking Bacon to some degree. But at the same time, I think there's a reason why it kind of comes back to Bacon in a lot of ways. The idea that we can just, look in this kind of bottom-up way of going about epistemology, and the kind of method that he wants to do in the inductive sense, I think also kind of shows a sort of characteristic of wanting to account for particulars that aren't privileged, I suppose, would be using today's language for it. But moreover, I think you have to put Bacon into his actual historical context, and see why he would want to divorce science and break up these sort of categories for his own means of trying to get away from theological judgments. And to that degree, then he was quite successful. But I think if we were to look at Bacon now and see the kind of ethics and what modern science would come ultimately from his sort of foundational or lack of foundational in a kind of metaphysical sense way of going about things would turn into, in its sort of own tradition and its own standalone, not for its theological purposes, but actually the kind of survivalist outlook that Dewey and the pragmatic schools would come about later. But of course, that's what I'm really trying to get at, is you can't necessarily accuse Bacon of setting the stage. There's a lot of interpretation. It really has more to do with the legacy of Bacon and that sort of sense of how he was interpreted going forward, and the use of the cultural mandate going forward. We can't necessarily accuse Bacon of doing that himself. Would be an important point in the kind of dominant nature attitude that would come from his interpretation. But I do actually think there is some faith, though, that could be applied to his critique, though, in that, if you want to have this sort of inductive system, if you want to have this method, ultimately you're going to have to delegate these sort of empirical truths, what's agreed upon in that sort of way. Obviously, hindsight is 20/20, of course, but seeing how the sciences would eventually overcome the kind of theological space that once was done in his time would be another thing to consider. And how do we actually assort these data points in that sort of sense of, we could just go on forever about these sort of things, but it seems the more complex that we've gotten in our times, the more examination of particular things has ultimately led to just more anxiety, more angst, more uncertainty of these sort of universal ideas and kind of deductive reasoning that actually was more in a kind of affirmative way in the sort of certainty as opposed to the uncertainty of probability. And I think that could be examined in and of itself, of looking at the world for its certainties and the certain deductions that you could be made across a disciplinary space, as opposed to these kind of specialties really that go on forever, I think, because of how complex particular data can be from this kind of ground up sort of way. I think would be perhaps a way of going about a critique here. But yeah, that would be the summation of this video. I think I'm satisfied with it, and I hope you guys are too, and thanks for watching. I'll see you for the next one.